Funding for Firing Line is made possible by the financial support of viewers like you and by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Mobile Corporation, Farley Industries, Incorporated, Monarch Financial Services, Incorporated, Payne Weber, and the Friends of Firing Line.
"19 years ago, Rosalyn Tureck appeared on Firing Line in a program which we titled, Why Are They Afraid of Bach? Miss Tureck, who's widely acknowledged as the foremost keyboard interpreter of Bach, flatly denied the proposition, insisting that young people were in fact turning to Bach and finding in him not the dry, puristic artist discarded in the 19th century, but rather a composer of great passion and wit. I don't think she was wrong about Bach, but I'm very much afraid that she overestimated the musical curiosity of our youth, since I look out of my window and I don't see students in Tiananmen Square clamoring for more Bach. And this is coincidentally a pity because Rosalyn Tureck has just brought out another record, the Goldberg Variations, the aria of which you heard opening this program, a compact disc of the Goldberg, which is the version I'd want with me if I was stranded on a desert island with only one interpretation of this masterwork. It's produced by Classical Music Incorporated and is available at your music store. I have a feeling that for all that we do know that there are people looking at opera and listening to opera and ballet and string quartets and Van Cliburn competitions all around us. The classical constituency is small, and that for Bach, very, very small, though every year that goes by confirms him in my judgment as the greatest musical genius who ever lived. But let's stick it to Miss Tureck. I should like to begin by asking her, are you surprised by the longevity of rock music and by its apparently unlimited hold on young people?
No, I'm not surprised because this is on the late 20th century folk music as I view it. It's popular music. There's always been folk music, which I think has been much more widespread than what we call art music. Art music has always been associated with a smaller group of people. However, the popular music that we called folk music was always a fertilizing material, nutrients for art music. And I think that's happening today too. In fact, perhaps we have an even better situation in that it seems that Bach is fertilizing the jazz and the rock people, and those people are also influencing the composers of our time.
Well, now, that's a fascinating thesis, and one supposes that there is the kind of music that's sung and danced. But the popular impression is that during the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, that music wasn't so easily distinguishable from the kind of music that one sat down and listened to. But you're telling me it was?
Yes, I think there was a great difference between the lovely little folk melodies that were sung and the kind of music that the general popular folk danced to at their May festivals.
But there was a cross-pollination.
Absolutely. The difference was the court music and the folk music. And there's a great difference between court music, an enormous difference between court dance and folk dance.
Well, I can understand what George Gershwin got from Cole Porter or whatever, but I'm not certain I understand what it is that our modern composers are getting from rock. Is this a subject that you've looked at or not?
Well, the subject that I've looked at and that I think about has to do what happened in the early 20th century when composers of the art world, the art music world, skipped over the European culture and went to Africa and began to study the rhythms of that music. which entered into Stravinsky from the early days, as you all know, The Rite of Spring and such works.
Did they get that from Africa, or did they get that from the Black South in America?
Oh, got it from Africa. Definitely from Africa, just as Picasso also got inspiration from Africa, certainly not from the south of the United States. And so it really is a much more fundamental source. And actually, there's certain African music that's extremely complex. In fact, their rhythmic counterpoint is much more complex than European rhythm. And so there was an enormous range there. Now, these kind of rhythms have entered into contemporary art music, they have entered into popular music, they've entered into jazz and into rock. And it's, as I see it, it is quite a direct channel of nourishment to both contemporary art music and rock music. Of course, there still is an enormous European influence when you consider Schoenberg and Stravinsky and Webern and Messiaen and Varese and those people, but these are all interlocking influences. And the young people of today who are composing serious music are actually incorporating all of the far out kind of scales and harmonies of the Schoenberg, the Webern, the Varese, and the more recent, as well as an influence, I feel, from the deeper, earlier source. And I think it's also in rock. The difference is that, with all due respect, I suppose people will disagree with me violently, some people anyway, but I can't believe that I can't regard rock music as complex, as challenging as the music that I know today. I still feel, and I've thought about this because I'm very much a contemporary person, even with playing Johann Sebastian. And there is no question in my mind that the compositions of the art world are still much more complex than rock music. Rock music has advanced to the point where there is complexity, enormous imagination and interest, but I think it stops very short.
Well, if one were to say, introduce on the assumption that they hadn't already heard it, 20 young composers to 20 volumes of the Rolling Stones, what would they most likely prescind from that experience that would affect their improvisation? Is it the rhythm? Is it the atonality?
It's mostly
Is it the
rhythm.
exuberance?
Yes,
What is it?
It's mostly the rhythm.
Mostly
Yes,
the rhythm.
the atonality still continues to be enormously much more complex and much more far out, and it's gone almost beyond atonality, in fact.
Well, I'm willing to accept the proposition that some of the people in the Rolling Stones and the Beatles are serious musicians.
Yes.
What did they get from Bach?
It's difficult for me to pinpoint what they get from Bach, except that
It's impossible for me to. It's impossible for me.
I think that they feel an affinity with the contrapuntal idea and with the more cyclic idea that comes from fugal thinking rather than the sonata thinking, which is quite another kind of basic concept. And these concepts interest me very much. I'll just relate to you a little story of a person who came to me to study with me, and he was an extremely successful player of rock. And he wanted to study with me, and I thought this would be really quite a lot of fun. I found it quite a challenge, and so I took him on.
You want to study composition or piano?
Piano, performance. He wanted to go farther in his performance on the piano of the music that he played.
Right.
Well, at the same time, he felt it necessary to do some studying in what we might call the classical period. And so this was going to be interesting. So I devised a very special repertoire for him, and I gave him some Scarlatti and some Mozart, which I thought would develop certain things that he needed technically, rhythmically, and so forth, and that would still have some relation to what he was doing, because I feel there is a relationship there. So he was very good, he worked very hard, but what I found extremely interesting was I gave him a simple Mozart sonata. He could not keep time.
Well, now, does that relate to the abandon with which rock is played? You more or less speed up when you feel like it?
Yes, they, of course, they don't have, they're not very much concerned with bar lines. And they're not very much concerned with, despite the fact that one talks about the beat, that kind of regularity that comes into the music of the late 18th century.
But you didn't feel the pulse of it?
Not only didn't feel the pulse, but almost physiologically could not say 1, 2, 3, 4.
Well, did you try him with a metronome?
I tried him with everything.
It didn't work.
It just didn't work. 6 months on one movement of a simple Mozart sonata, and at the end of 6 months, he still couldn't play 1, 2, 3, 4.
Well, now, how would Bach help somebody of the kind you describe? And is that influence at hand?
I wouldn't recommend Bach for this particular kind of thing, for a rock player to improve his performance, but I feel a tremendous affinity, and I think there is an affinity between the popular rock and some of the elements that go into the form in which Bach was working. And it isn't so much Johann Sebastian or this piece or that piece, but it's a sense of form that links us with Bach.
Well, if we are convinced, as you are, that Bach yields special pleasures, then to the extent that those pleasures aren't experienced, we feel that people are missing out on something, right?
Yes.
So since the 20 years ago when we first discussed this subject, what has happened that makes you encouraged on this point?
I do
Are there
think
more Bach? Is more Bach being played? Are there more harpsichord recitals in New York City than there were 20 years ago? What are the signs that make you feel good?
Well, there's no doubt that there's a great proliferation of interest in Bach. Many Bach festivals, they're all over the world. Internationally, you find them. And
More than 20 years ago?
yes, definitely. Winter and summer in small towns, in large cities. And the 300th anniversary of Bach's birth in 1985 witnessed enormous activity throughout the world. At the same time, there are these series, sometimes a recital series or an orchestral series, a choral series. People do cantatas, and there's no doubt that there's a great deal more Bach being played in this way. But I find a very interesting phenomenon now. With the proliferation also of historical instruments, which I'm very much for, because I myself have played them since I'm 14 years old, and I play them all, the harpsichord, the clavichord, the organ, and I love them. But at the same time, I find that not very much Bach is being played in the general concert-making world of our time.
Why?
That is very interesting. I know that when I was a student and in my early years, virtually every solo piano program began with a work of Bach, and in the regular symphony orchestra concerts in their series, the conductors were not loath to program Bach.
I'm surprised to hear you say that, because I read a life of Glenn Gould recently, and when he began with the G major partita, the critics were astonished that he should have done that. And yet you say that this was really quite a workaday experience.
Oh, well,
34 years ago.
that would have been just before him. There was, I think there was, it dipped. As the historical instrument development grew, this other side of the coin just almost collapsed. And when I began to play all these Bach series, I mean, people said it can't be done. I remember that no manager would have anything to do with it. In my first Bach series, when I was 23 years old, I played 6 concerts, one each week for 6 weeks, with all the 48 preludes and fugues and the Goldberg variations and so forth and so on. And not only managers, but professional musicians said, this is folly. It can't be done. It can't be a success. Well, it was a success, and I began to play Bach series all over the country, and then the same thing happened in Europe. So, but for a long time I was the only one. And as I say, in the normal course of regular series of concerts, you don't hear Bach anymore. It really, the conductors are very frightened to conduct Bach because there has been so much emphasis upon the authentic, the so-called authentic style, and 18th century, 17th and 18th century instruments. Now, as I say, I'm all for it. I've conducted them myself many times. But I think this should go part and parcel in our culture, because otherwise we really do put this music, not only Bach, but all the music since the mid-19th century going backward, into a museum behind glass. There's a certain exoticism in seeing and hearing, say, an early 18th century instrument or 16th century instrument. And although it's tremendously important for musicians to know them, and I believe every pianist should study harpsichord, clavichord, and organ, just as I think every violinist should study the viol family and work with the Bach bows. But this is part of education and part of our art and part of our life. But we are negating our 20th century altogether and erasing our present selves.
By this sort of a superstitious reluctance to use contemporary instruments.
Yes, and the point is that there are ways to play Bach on contemporary instruments. I don't play the piano. When I play Bach on the piano, I don't play the piano the way I play Brahms on the piano, or Chopin, or Liszt, or Prokofiev, or even Beethoven. I play the piano in a totally different way, and I labored in my early years in order to find and create a technique for playing this music which would be true to its form and structure and its spirit on this instrument. And it can be done. And I think that a piece of information that's been very slow, I think, in filtering through to the musical public is that Bach was a salesman for the piano. He never ruled out the piano. And he tried the pianos at the court of Frederick the Great in his famous visit in 1747. And in fact, it's very much believed now that he wrote the musical offering, the keyboard parts, with the piano in mind, because he had tried all these pianos at Frederick's. And at the same time, we have a receipt signed by Bach in his own hand showing that he had sold a Silbermann piano to a Count Branitzky.
Yeah. Well, I think in discussing Bach, we should reiterate a point that I heard you make frequently during the third century celebrations, which was that Bach, more often than not, expected to be heard in a room about this size, right?
Yeah.
The so-called house concert.
Yes.
And this Goldberg that you did at my house was a room about this size, right?
Yes.
Now, to what extent does Bach depend on the intimacy of this kind of an atmosphere? Not at all, does he?
Well,
Except
I have found it
if you're
doesn't.
using the clavichord, obviously.
Yeah, well, yes. The music itself, I think, does not depend on the smallness of a room, but the danger in our time, and here again is something where we must find a balance, is that, for instance, the clavichord can be heard in a room of this size, but it certainly cannot be heard in Carnegie Hall or in the Royal Festival Hall in London, which is where I play all the time. And this is, again, these are the conditions of music making of the mid and the late 20th century. And there are ways of making that music in a large hall. The music itself can stand it, but you can't use a clavichord there.
Well, the Goldberg was anticipated would be played for the benefit of somebody who suffered from somnambulism to make him feel good, right?
Yes, that's
and that was
the
therefore
story.
Bach envisioned, to the extent that he was concerned with the question, a fairly intimate situation.
Yes.
But it doesn't affect its playability before a large audience at all, does it?
Not at all, not at all. I mean, when Bach wrote
I mean,
that...
I heard you play in the White House, part of it, with a few hundred people there.
Yes,
And,
it was larger than this
what's the
room, wasn't
largest
it?
audience you've ever had for the Goldberg?
Oh, well,
on the piano?
Regularly at Festival Hall, I had 3,000 people with 500 on the stage.
Well, but that meant magnification, didn't it?
Oh, no. Then I played the piano. I played Bach on the piano in those halls. When I play in smaller halls, I will often play Bach on the harpsichord. In fact, in that anniversary year of Bach, I did 2 series for Carnegie Hall. I did one in the smaller hall, in the recital hall, where I conducted and I played, I conducted 18th century strings, and I played the organ, the harpsichord, and the clavichord. And a few months later at Carnegie Hall, I did a whole season of concerts in the large hall where I always play, and there I used contemporary instruments and the piano.
Well, you also played it before dinner and after dinner on different instruments, because I heard you do that a couple times.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Well, if you were asked to point out what is it that is distinctive about the Goldberg, what would you say? It is now a highly celebrated piece of music, and it was almost undiscovered a generation ago, wasn't it? That is, very few people played it or had heard it.
Yes, there was
so
this.
what was its inherent magic?
The original legend was that it was impossible on the piano. When I learned the Goldbergs when I was 17 years old, I learned them in 5 weeks and then performed them at the school. And the next day, the president of the school met me in the hall. He said, he was so sorry he couldn't hear the concert, but he said, I hear you played the Goldberg Variations, and I was told it was impossible, that this is the general reputation, it's impossible on one keyboard. And I remember looking up at him and he said, oh, I didn't know it was impossible. Now that was the general legend about the Goldberg Variations.
You mean it had not been performed on the piano up until you did it?
It hadn't been performed hardly at all. And in fact, Busoni, when he made an edition of the Goldberg Variations, he omitted a number of them, which he thought would be too difficult to do on one keyboard. Now, the point is, most of these variations are written for one keyboard. So we must understand that the whole work is not written for 2 keyboards at all. Most of them are for one keyboard, and just a few are pointed out as for 2 keyboards.
But anyway, the point is that you licked that as a technical problem.
Oh, yes.
So that many pianists have since played it on a single keyboard without
indeed.
worrying about the...
Yes, and that, actually the Goldberg Variations are one of the most frequently played works of Bach.
Well,
but
to go back to my question, what that's distinctive about it musically rather than mechanically?
Well...
Is it
well,
just
for
the
me,
architecture, the musical architecture
the
of it?
musical architecture is so miraculous that it just feels a miracle every time I think of it, every time I play it. The complexity of the contrapuntal writing, the canons, you know, there are 9 canons, and are so unbelievable, and yet you don't need to know that they're canons. You don't need to know what they're doing, because the music is so extraordinarily beautiful and so moving and so imaginative, and there's such enormous variety. Every variation is so different.
Why did it take so very long for people to recognize this? You say it was practically not played at all.
Yes. Firstly, because of its technical difficulty, and I think secondly, because there was this aura for about 150 years in the general music consciousness. I'm not speaking of the minority who appreciated Bach very early on, even in the early 19th century. But I'm speaking of the general music-going public and even the general kind of music-studying public. You know, there's a little sort of joke about a fugue. A fugue is a piece of music in which the voices come in one by one and the audience leaves one by one.
Well, I hope the audience has not left, because, as I told you, I'm going to ask you to play a couple of minutes during the close from this, your magnificent interpretation of the Goldberg. So let me free you up here. What are you going to play?
I play the 28th and 29th variation.
Good luck.
Both of them from the Goldbergs.
Funding for Firing Line is made possible by the financial support of viewers like you and by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Mobile Corporation, Farley Industries, Incorporated, Monarch Financial Services, Incorporated, Payne Weber, and the Friends of Firing Line. This program was produced by SICA, which is solely responsible for its content. For a printed bound transcript of this program, send $3 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. Indicate the subject of the program and please allow 3 weeks for delivery.